The Fairchild absence. Boston's autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and old secrets when Dr. Rebecca Morrison first encountered the daguerreotype. The wind that October morning swept down Beacon Hill with a bitter edge, rattling the windows of the Historical Society's Restoration Laboratory and carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Rebecca had arrived before dawn, as was her habit during the 3 years since Emma vanished, finding that work was the only thing that could quiet the constant questions in her mind, the endless scenarios of what might have happened to her daughter. She had been hired by the Boston Historical Society to catalogue and restore a collection of 19th-century photographs discovered in the basement of a demolished brownstone on Beacon Hill. The building had belonged to the Fairchild family, prominent textile merchants whose fortune had evaporated as mysteriously as their bloodline. The demolition crew had found a sealed room behind a false wall, untouched for nearly a century, filled with documents, ledgers, and dozens of daguerreotypes carefully wrapped in protective cloth. The Fairchild name meant little to most modern Bostonians, but Rebecca's research had revealed a family that had once wielded enormous power in Massachusetts. Harold Fairchild and his brother Thomas had owned 7 textile mills along the Charles River in the 1880s, employing thousands of workers, mostly immigrants from Ireland and Italy, who had fled poverty and persecution in their homelands, only to find themselves trapped in 12-hour shifts, dangerous machinery, wages barely sufficient to keep their families fed. The Fairchilds had been ruthless opponents of labor organization, had testified before the state legislature against reforms that would limit working hours or improve safety conditions. Their arguments had been couched in the language of freedom. Workers should be free to negotiate their own terms. Government regulation was tyranny. The invisible hand of the market would correct any genuine problems. By 1924, the Fairchild fortune was gone. Harold had died in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic, though rumors persisted that his death had not been from illness, but from a more violent cause. His wife, Catherine, had followed him to the grave within months, and their mills had been sold off, dismantled, absorbed into larger corporate entities. No children inherited the estate, no grandchildren carried on the name. The family simply ceased to exist as completely as if they had never been. Only these photographs remained, silent witnesses to a bloodline that had ended. Rebecca was a woman who understood the weight of silence in ways that went beyond professional expertise. At 42, she had spent the last 15 years working in the quiet company of the dead, their faces frozen in silver and chemicals, their expressions offering small windows into lives lived and lost. Her colleagues at the Society often joked that she preferred the past to the present, and they weren't entirely wrong. The present had taken too much from her, had left wounds that refused to heal, no matter how many years passed. Her daughter, Emma, had vanished 3 years ago from a college campus in Vermont, disappeared as completely as if she had never existed. 20 years old, brilliant, full of passionate questions about justice and freedom and the responsibilities of citizens in a democracy. Emma had been studying political science and journalism, had written articles for the campus newspaper about civil liberties, about government surveillance programs that had been dramatically expanded after a series of terrorist attacks in the early 2010s. She had been fierce and uncompromising in her beliefs, had inherited her mother's stubbornness and her father's idealism. The day Emma disappeared, she had been attending a protest outside the campus administration building. Students had organized a demonstration against the university's cooperation with federal surveillance programs, against the installation of facial recognition cameras throughout the campus, against policies that allowed law enforcement access to student records without warrants or notification. It had been a peaceful protest, well organized, with speakers and signs, and perhaps 200 students gathered in the autumn sunshine. Emma had texted her mother that morning, sent a picture of herself holding a sign that read, "Privacy is freedom. Don't let them watch us into submission." That was the last communication Rebecca ever received from her daughter. By evening, Emma had not returned to her dorm. By the next morning, her roommate had reported her missing. The police investigation had been thorough but fruitless. Emma's phone had been found in a trash can 3 blocks from campus, wiped clean. Her laptop had never been recovered. Security cameras near the protest had experienced technical difficulties that day. The footage corrupted and unusable. Witnesses remembered seeing Emma at the demonstration but had conflicting recollections about when she had left, who she had been talking to, whether she had left alone or with others. The official investigation had eventually concluded that Emma had likely been the victim of an opportunistic abduction, possibly by someone who had been watching the protest and had targeted a vulnerable young woman walking alone. But no body was ever found, no ransom demand ever made, no physical evidence ever discovered. After 6 months, the case went cold. The detective assigned to it had been sympathetic but honest, without evidence, without witnesses, without even a clear timeline of Emma's movements after the protest. There was little more they could do. Rebecca should prepare herself for the possibility that she might never know what happened to her daughter. Rebecca's husband, Michael, had not been able to bear that uncertainty. Their marriage, already strained by different approaches to parenting and life, had fractured completely under the weight of Emma's disappearance. Michael had wanted to hold a memorial service, to accept that Emma was gone, to try to move forward with some kind of closure. Rebecca had refused, could not accept that her daughter was dead without proof, could not give up hope, no matter how irrational that hope might be. They had divorced quietly, 18 months after Emma vanished, dividing their possessions and their grief, going their separate ways to cope with loss, in ways the other could not understand or support. Since then, Rebecca had buried herself in her work, spending long hours in the Historical Society's climate-controlled restoration laboratory, carefully bringing old photographs back from the edge of decay. There was something comforting about the process, about the methodical application of chemistry and patience to reveal images that had been hidden beneath tarnish and time. Unlike the present, the past could be uncovered, studied, understood. The dead in these photographs had finished their stories. Their fates were fixed, unchangeable, comprehensible in ways that Emma's absence could never be. The Fairchild Daguerreotype sat in a wooden case lined with worn velvet, the interior stained with age and humidity. Rebecca had cleaned dozens of these images before, understood the delicate process of removing decades of tarnish and grime without damaging the fragile silver surface beneath. But this one felt different from the moment she opened the case, though she could not have explained why. Perhaps it was the unusual heaviness of the tarnish, dark and thick, almost deliberately applied. Perhaps it was the way the sealed case had been found in that hidden room, wrapped in black cloth and tucked into a corner as if someone had wanted it forgotten. Perhaps it was simply Rebecca's state of mind, the way grief had sensitized her to sorrow in all its forms, made her attentive to loss and absence in ways she had never been before Emma vanished. She began the restoration process on a Monday morning in late October, setting up her workspace with the careful precision of ritual: distilled water, cotton swabs, specialized chemical solutions arranged in precise order, magnifying lenses positioned to catch the best light. The work required patience, gentle circular motions with barely dampened cotton, removing the tarnish molecule by molecule without scratching the silver underneath. It was meditative work, the kind that allowed her mind to wander while her hands maintained their steady rhythm. As she worked, the image began to emerge with frustrating slowness. The first day revealed only shadows, vague outlines of figures. The second day brought more definition: 2 adults, standing and sitting in the formal pose typical of 1880s portraiture. The man stood behind, his hand resting on the back of a wooden chair. The woman sat, her hands folded in her lap, her dress high-collared and buttoned to the throat. Both had the stiff, slightly uncomfortable expressions that long exposure times demanded, the particular quality of faces forced to remain absolutely still for 30 seconds or more. On the third day, as Rebecca continued her patient work on the space between the two adults, something unexpected began to appear. At first, she thought it was a flaw in the plate, perhaps a chemical imperfection or damage from improper storage. But as she cleaned more carefully, more slowly, a third figure emerged with shocking clarity. A child, a girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with pale hair pulled back from her face and enormous dark eyes that seemed to stare directly through the camera lens, through the decades, into Rebecca's workroom with an intensity that made her breath catch. Rebecca stopped working and stepped back from the table, her heart racing for reasons she could not entirely articulate. There was something profoundly unsettling about those eyes, about the way the child's image was so much clearer than her parents'. In most daguerreotypes, children were slightly blurred because they couldn't remain still during the long exposure, but this girl was perfectly sharp, impossibly focused, as if she had been more present in that moment than the adults around her, or as if she had been captured by some different process entirely. Rebecca returned to her computer and pulled up the documentation that had accompanied the Fairchild collection. She scrolled through the inventory list, the genealogical records, the census data from the 1880s. Harold Fairchild and Catherine Fairchild were extensively documented. Marriage certificate from 1875, property records showing the purchase of the Beacon Hill brownstone in 1880, financial documents related to their textile mills, memberships in various social clubs and business associations. But nowhere in any of these records was there any mention of a child. She expanded her search, looking through Massachusetts birth records, baptismal records from local churches, even death records in case a child had been born and died young. Nothing. No daughter of Harold and Catherine Fairchild appeared in any official documentation. Yet here was this girl, photographed between them, her presence as undeniable as it was inexplicable. Rebecca examined the daguerreotype more closely through her magnifying lens. The image quality was extraordinarily high, even for the standards of professional photographers of that era. The details were crisp, the texture of the fabrics, the patterns in the wallpaper behind them, the expressions on the adults' faces. And the child, that strange child with her two knowing eyes, seemed to be the focal point of the entire composition, even though traditional portrait conventions of the time would have centered the frame on the adults. There was something else that bothered Rebecca, something that took her several minutes to identify. The child's clothing was wrong, subtly but definitely wrong. While the adults wore clothing consistent with upper-class Boston fashion of the 1880s, the girl's dress was simpler, plainer, the kind of garment that working-class children might wear. The fabric looked rougher, the cut less refined. It was as if she didn't belong in this family portrait, as if she had been inserted into a scene where she didn't fit. Rebecca brought the photograph to her supervisor, Martin Ashford, a man who had worked at the Historical Society for 30 years and knew more about Boston's hidden histories than perhaps anyone alive. She found him in his cramped office on the 3rd floor, surrounded by filing cabinets and stacks of books. The walls covered with old maps of the city, showing streets and buildings that no longer existed. Martin was 68, officially retired, but unable to stay away from the work that had defined his adult life. He came in 3 days a week as a consultant, puttered around the archives, helped younger staff navigate the complex genealogies and property records of Boston's old families. She placed the clean daguerreotype on his desk and explained what she had found. The child who appeared in no records, the unsettling clarity of her image, the wrongness of her clothing. Martin picked up the photograph with hands that Rebecca noticed were trembling slightly. He examined it through his magnifying glass for a long time, his expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. When he finally looked up, his face had gone pale, and there was something in his eyes that Rebecca had never seen before. Not just concern, but fear. Martin set the daguerreotype down carefully, as if it might shatter or burn. He told Rebecca, his voice quiet and strained, that she should lock the photograph away, file it as damaged beyond restoration, forget she had ever cleaned it. When Rebecca protested, demanded an explanation for such an unusual request, Martin stood up and walked to his office window, staring out at Beacon Hill's gas lamps and brick sidewalks as if gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. He told her that there were certain collections in the Historical Society's vault, materials that existed only to be forgotten, not displayed, photographs, documents, records that powerful families had paid the Society substantial endowments to acquire and bury. The official reason was always preservation, protecting fragile materials from public handling. But Martin had been at the Society long enough to understand the real reason. Some histories were too embarrassing, too incriminating, too dangerous to be allowed into public consciousness. Rebecca pressed him for more details. What was so dangerous about a photograph of a child? Martin turned back to face her, and she could see him wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally, he sat back down and told her a story that he said she must never repeat, that could cost both of them their positions if anyone knew he had shared it. In the 1970s, when Martin had first started working at the Society, he had been assigned to catalogue a collection of materials donated by the descendants of several prominent Boston families. Among those materials had been photographs, letters, and ledgers documenting various business activities in the late 19th century. Martin, young and idealistic, had begun noticing patterns in these documents, references to payments made to local police, to judges, to politicians, references to problems solved, obstacles removed, threats eliminated, and occasionally references to children, procured, placed, disposed of. He had started investigating further, correlating these cryptic references with historical records of missing persons, with old newspaper accounts of disappearances and unexplained deaths. What he had found suggested something horrific. An informal system by which wealthy industrialists had for decades used working-class children as disposable labor, subjects for medical experiments, or worse, children who would not be missed, whose immigrant parents had little recourse to law or justice, who could vanish without investigation or consequence. When Martin had tried to bring these findings to his supervisors, suggesting that the Society had a responsibility to expose this history, he had been firmly shut down. The board of directors at that time had included descendants of several of the families implicated in the documents. He was told that his interpretation was speculative, irresponsible, potentially libelous. He was told that his job was to preserve and catalogue, not to make historical accusations that could damage the Society's reputation and relationships with its donors. He was, not quite explicitly but clearly enough, told to forget what he had found or find employment elsewhere. Martin had capitulated, had spent the following decades doing his job, keeping his suspicions to himself. But he had never forgotten, and he had noticed how certain materials would periodically disappear from the archives, how certain searches would be discouraged, how certain questions would be deflected. The Society, he said, served two purposes: to preserve history and to protect the powerful from their history. The Fairchild family, Martin explained, had been among the worst of Boston's industrial dynasties. Their mills had injury rates far above the average. Their labor practices had been borderline slavery, and there had long been rumors that Harold Fairchild had interests that went beyond mere profit. Rumors about private rooms beneath his mills, where children worked in conditions too terrible to expose to daylight, doing tasks too specialized or too disturbing to be entrusted to adult workers. Rumors about medical experiments, about products whose manufacture required components that could not legally or ethically be obtained. Nothing that had ever been proven, nothing that had survived in official records, but persistent enough across multiple sources that Martin believed there was truth beneath the whispers. The child in the daguerreotype, Martin suggested, might have been one of these missing children, perhaps photographed with the Fairchilds as proof of some transaction, or perhaps as a trophy, or perhaps for reasons Martin didn't want to speculate about. The fact that the photograph had been hidden, that the tarnish had been deliberately applied, suggested that even the Fairchilds had recognized that this image was dangerous, that it documented something that needed to be concealed. Martin made Rebecca promise to lock the daguerreotype away and forget about it. He said that some truths were too dangerous to excavate, that the powerful protected their legacies across generations, that people who asked too many questions about these old families had a tendency to find their careers destroyed, or worse. Rebecca agreed, not because she believed he was right, but because she could see how frightened he was, how much it had cost him to tell her even this much. But Rebecca couldn't let it go. That night, unable to sleep as usual, she lay in bed and thought about the child's eyes, thought about Emma's eyes, thought about the particular expression both held, a knowledge of injustice, a silent scream that could not be heard, a presence that insisted on being acknowledged despite all attempts to erase it. She got up at 2 in the morning and drove to the Historical Society, let herself in with her security key, went directly to the restoration room. She carefully photographed the daguerreotype with her phone from multiple angles, capturing every detail in high resolution. Then she spent the rest of the night in the Society's reading room, searching through digitized historical newspapers, obituaries, and police records from the 1880s. She found nothing about a Fairchild child, but she found something else, something that made her blood run cold. In September 1884, the same month the daguerreotype was dated, there had been a small news item about 6 children who'd gone missing from the working-class neighborhoods of Boston's North End. All girls between the ages of 7 and 9. All vanished within a 2-week period. The newspapers of the time had barely covered the disappearances. After all, these were children of Irish and Italian immigrants, not proper Boston society. The story died quickly, replaced by news of textile workers organizing strikes, demanding better conditions, shorter hours, freedom from the grinding machinery that consumed their lives. Rebecca spent the next week obsessively researching. She discovered that Harold Fairchild had been one of the most vociferous opponents of labor reform, had testified before the Massachusetts legislature against laws limiting child labor and factory hours. He had argued that regulation was tyranny, that workers should be grateful for employment, that freedom meant the freedom to work without government interference. His textile mills had been among the most dangerous in Boston, with injury and death rates that shocked even by the standards of the time. The more Rebecca learned, the more a terrible pattern emerged. In 1884, 6 girls disappeared. In 1895, 8 more children vanished from the tenement districts. In 1906, a dozen teenagers disappeared, all activists who had been organizing for voting rights and labor protections. Each wave of disappearances coincided with periods of social upheaval, with workers and citizens demanding their rights, their freedom from exploitation. And each time, the disappearances were barely investigated, the victims quickly forgotten, their families too poor and powerless to demand answers. Rebecca expanded her search to modern times. She created a spreadsheet marking every unexplained disappearance in Massachusetts over the past 50 years. The pattern continued. Young people, activists, protesters, journalists investigating government corruption or corporate malfeasance. They vanished at a rate that far exceeded statistical probability. Some were eventually found dead, suicides ruled by medical examiners despite suspicious circumstances. Others simply ceased to exist, as if they had been erased from the world. Emma's disappearance fit the pattern perfectly. She had been researching the expansion of domestic surveillance programs, writing articles for her college newspaper about how anti-terrorism legislation was being used to suppress dissent, to monitor citizens who questioned authority. She had attended that protest in Vermont, carrying a sign about the First Amendment, about the freedom to speak truth to power, and then she was gone, another data point in Rebecca's spreading web of vanished lives. One name kept appearing in Rebecca's research: Convergence Strategic Solutions, a private security contractor with deep ties to both government agencies and corporate interests. The company had been founded in 1982, but Rebecca traced its corporate lineage back further, through a series of predecessor companies, each with slightly different names but the same basic function: providing security, managing labor disputes, handling problems for powerful clients who preferred to keep their hands clean. The trail went back to the 1880s, to something called Fairchild Industrial Services. Rebecca knew she should stop. Martin had warned her, and her survival instinct screamed that she was approaching something dangerous. But she couldn't stop. Emma's face, the daguerreotype child's face, they merged in her mind. She had to know what had happened, had to understand the pattern, had to shine light into this darkness, even if it consumed her. She contacted someone she had sworn never to speak to again, James Chen, an investigative journalist who had covered Emma's disappearance 3 years ago. James had been aggressive, insensitive, treating Rebecca's tragedy as a story rather than a life destroyed. But he had also been thorough, and he had told her things off the record, disturbing things about other disappearances, about patterns he had noticed but couldn't prove, about sources who had warned him to back off before he ended up vanished himself. They met in a coffee shop in Cambridge, far from the Historical Society, far from Rebecca's usual haunts. James had aged in 3 years, new lines around his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He listened to Rebecca's findings, examined the photographs she had taken of the daguerreotype, reviewed her spreadsheet of disappearances. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, stirring his cold coffee. James told her that he had kept investigating after Emma vanished, even after his editor killed the story. He had found a pattern extending beyond Massachusetts, beyond disappearances. He had found facilities, private properties owned by shell companies linked to Convergent Strategic Solutions. Black sites, he called them. Places where people could be held indefinitely, questioned, broken, without any legal oversight or public knowledge. Detention centers that existed in the gaps of the legal system, where the concept of rights and freedom simply didn't apply. He said the government knew about them, used them, but maintained deniability through layers of private contractors. Rebecca asked if Emma might be in one of these places. James looked away, unable to meet her eyes. He said that most people held in such facilities didn't last long. The ones who emerged were fundamentally changed, their spirit broken, their memories fragmented. They signed non-disclosure agreements, accepted payment for their silence, and lived out their remaining years as ghosts, too afraid or too damaged to speak about what had happened to them. He said he had interviewed 3 such people, all activists who had disappeared and mysteriously returned months or years later. Their stories were similar: isolation, interrogation, psychological manipulation designed to make them doubt reality itself, question their own perceptions, believe that resistance was futile and freedom was an illusion. Rebecca felt something break inside her. The hope she had been carrying, the belief that Emma might still be alive somewhere, waiting to be found, shattered like old glass. But beneath the grief, a cold anger began to crystallize. She thought about the daguerreotype child, about those missing girls from 1884, about over a century of people vanished for demanding their rights, for questioning power, for believing in freedom. James warned her to stop investigating, said that people who looked too closely at these patterns tended to disappear themselves or suffer fatal accidents. He said he had already been followed, his apartment broken into twice, his sources going silent one by one. But Rebecca could see in his eyes that he wasn't going to stop either. They were both too far in, had lost too much to turn back. Over the next month, they worked together, piecing together a map of disappearances and facilities. They discovered a property in western Massachusetts, an old estate that had once belonged to a branch of the Fairchild family. It was now owned by a subsidiary of Convergence Strategic Solutions, listed as a corporate retreat center. But local residents reported never seeing anyone coming or going, only security patrols and high fences topped with cameras. James had a contact, a former security guard at Convergence, who had quit after witnessing something that had shaken him so badly he had fled to Canada. The contact agreed to meet them, to provide documents that might prove what was happening at these facilities. They drove to Montreal on a Friday in October, 3 years and 2 weeks after Emma's disappearance. The city was beautiful in autumn, the leaves turning gold and red, tourists crowding the old streets. They met the contact, a man named David Reeves, in a small park near the St. Lawrence River. David was paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, insisting they walk while they talked, so that no one could record them easily. David told them about his time at Convergence, about the facility he had worked at in New Hampshire. He said it looked like a corporate training center on the surface, but below ground were detention cells, interrogation rooms, medical facilities designed for chemical and psychological experiments. He said the people brought there were designated as domestic security threats, but many were simply activists, journalists, whistleblowers who had become inconvenient to powerful interests. He said the legal justification was a classified interpretation of anti-terrorism legislation, signed by multiple administrations, allowing indefinite detention of citizens without trial if they were deemed threats to national security or economic stability. Rebecca asked if he had seen Emma. David shook his head, said there were multiple facilities and detainees were sometimes moved between them, identities obscured. But he gave them something else, a flash drive containing internal documents, staff lists, financial records showing the flow of government and corporate money into Convergence. He said it was enough to expose the program, if they could get it to the right people, if anyone was willing to publish it. James took the flash drive, promised to get it to sources at major newspapers, to journalists with the resources and courage to investigate. David made them promise to wait 2 weeks before releasing anything, to give him time to get further away, to disappear more completely. He said he had already given up everything, his career, his family, his country, for the chance to expose this darkness. He said that freedom meant nothing if you couldn't speak truth, couldn't oppose injustice without fear of vanishing. They parted ways with David in that Montreal park. Rebecca and James drove back to Boston in silence, both processing what they had learned, both understanding that they were now targets themselves. They agreed to wait the 2 weeks as promised, to use that time to make copies of the documents, to reach out to trusted contacts, to prepare for whatever response might come once the information became public. Rebecca went home that night and stood in Emma's old bedroom, unchanged since the day she disappeared. She looked at her daughter's books, her photographs, her notes about justice and freedom and the need for citizens to check governmental power. She understood now that Emma hadn't just disappeared randomly. She had been taken because she had been asking the right questions, looking in the right directions, threatening to expose systems designed to remain hidden. The next morning, Rebecca returned to the Historical Society. Martin wasn't there. had called in sick, something he rarely did. Rebecca went to the restoration room and retrieved the Fairchild Daguerreotype from the locked cabinet where Martin had ordered it stored. She looked again at the child's face, those dark eyes that seemed to know terrible things. She understood now what she was seeing, not a ghost, not something supernatural, but evidence. A child who had been erased from records, whose existence had been denied, whose disappearance had been covered up by people with power and money and influence. Rebecca carefully rephotographed the daguerreotype, capturing every detail in high resolution. She printed copies, made digital backups, stored them in multiple locations. This child would not be forgotten. None of them would be forgotten. She would make sure of that. She spent the next 2 weeks preparing, creating a comprehensive database of disappearances, connections to convergent strategic solutions, the historical pattern stretching back to the 1880s. She wrote a detailed account of everything she had learned, everything she suspected. She created a fail-safe. If she disappeared, if anything happened to her, the information would automatically be released to multiple news organizations, civil liberties groups, members of Congress known for their integrity. James did the same with his contacts, preparing to release David Reeves's documents as soon as the 2-week deadline passed. They spoke on the phone every few days, coordinating their efforts, sharing new findings. James had discovered financial connections between Convergence and several prominent politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, who had consistently voted to expand security legislation while quietly profiting from the contractors implementing those programs. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, a bipartisan effort to undermine the very freedoms they publicly claimed to protect. On the 13th day, Rebecca received a call from the Boston police. James Chen had been found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide, a single gunshot wound to the head. Rebecca felt the room spin around her. She knew immediately what had happened, knew that David Reeves was probably dead too, that the circle was closing. She had perhaps hours, perhaps only minutes. She uploaded everything to a secure server, sent encrypted files to 10 different journalists, activists, and attorneys she had researched carefully. Then she made one final decision. She wouldn't run, wouldn't hide. She would go to the facility in western Massachusetts, the old Fairchild estate, and try to document it, try to find proof of what was happening there. If she was going to disappear like Emma, like James, like all the others, she would at least go down trying to expose the truth. Rebecca drove west as the sun set, the autumn landscape darkening around her. She thought about freedom, about what it truly meant. Not just the absence of physical chains, but the ability to speak, to question, to oppose injustice without fear. She thought about how easily freedom could be eroded, how quickly rights could vanish behind classified interpretations and private contractors, and a public too distracted or too frightened to demand accountability. The Fairchild estate appeared through the trees just after dark, a large Victorian mansion surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Rebecca parked a mile away and approached on foot, carrying a camera with a telephoto lens. She stayed in the shadows, moving carefully, documenting everything she could see. The property was more extensive than she had expected. Multiple buildings, guard posts, vehicles marked with the Convergence logo. She was trying to get closer to one of the smaller buildings when the lights hit her, blindingly bright. She heard vehicles approaching, shouts to freeze, to put her hands up. She dropped the camera and raised her hands, her heart pounding, but her mind strangely calm. She had known this would happen, had accepted it when she made the decision to come here. They put a hood over her head, plastic cuffs on her wrists. She was pushed into a vehicle, driven for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. When the hood was finally removed, she was in a small concrete room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, no windows, a metal door with no handle on the inside. A man in an expensive suit sat across from her, no name tag, no identification. He told her that she had trespassed on private property, that she had stolen confidential business documents, that she had committed multiple federal crimes. He said she could make this easy or hard, that the choice was hers. Rebecca asked about Emma. The man's expression didn't change. He said he didn't know who that was, that Rebecca seemed confused, perhaps suffering from some kind of mental breakdown brought on by grief and obsession. He said that the facility she had been investigating was simply a corporate training center, that her conspiracy theories were the product of an unstable mind. He said that if she cooperated, if she agreed to receive treatment for her delusions, things would go much easier for her. Rebecca asked how long she would be held. The man smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. He said that depended entirely on her, on how quickly she could let go of these dangerous fantasies. He said that people who clung to false beliefs, who insisted on spreading misinformation that could damage national security or economic stability, sometimes needed extended care. He said that time had a way of bringing clarity, of helping people understand that resistance was not only futile, but harmful to themselves and others. Over the following days, weeks, perhaps months, Rebecca lost track of time in the windowless room. They moved her periodically to different cells, interrogated her repeatedly, asked her about James, about David Reeves, about everyone she had contacted. They showed her James's suicide note, claimed it was genuine, said he had been mentally ill and had unfortunately taken his own life. They showed her news articles about how Rebecca Morrison, a local historian, had suffered a psychotic break after her daughter's death and was receiving treatment at a private facility. They never physically tortured her, never laid a hand on her. But the isolation, the endless questions, the manipulation of time and information, the way they insisted that her memories were false, that Emma had never existed in the way she remembered, that she had fabricated a conspiracy to cope with random tragedy, wore at her sanity like water on stone. She began to doubt herself, to wonder if she had gone mad, if everything she had discovered was the product of grief-induced delusion. But then she would remember the daguerreotype, that child's face staring through time. She would remember Emma's passion for justice, her belief that citizens had not just the right, but the duty to question power, to demand accountability, to fight for freedom. And she would hold on to that memory like a lifeline, refusing to let them erase it, refusing to let them rewrite the truth. They showed her documents proving that the files from David Reeves had been fake, planted evidence designed to spread disinformation. They showed her psychiatric evaluations declaring her mentally incompetent, a danger to herself and others. They offered her a deal, sign an NDA, accept treatment, admit that she had fabricated everything and she could eventually leave, return to some semblance of normal life, refuse, and she would remain here indefinitely, a security risk too dangerous to release. Rebecca refused. Every time they asked, she refused. She told them that Emma had existed, that James had been murdered, that the pattern of disappearances was real, that facilities like this one were fundamentally incompatible with any meaningful definition of freedom. She told them that she would never stop telling the truth, that they could keep her body, but they couldn't take her mind, couldn't make her deny what she knew. The interrogator, the man in the expensive suit, seemed almost sad during their last session. He told her that she was making a difficult choice for herself, that people who refused to accept reality often lived very isolated, very long lives in facilities like this one. He said that in a way she was choosing to vanish, to make herself disappear, just like all the others she claimed to care about. He said that freedom was an illusion anyway, that everyone lived within systems of control, that the only real choice was whether to accept that gracefully or resist it futilely. Rebecca looked him in the eye and said that she would rather vanish fighting for the truth than exist as a lie. She said that history would eventually expose what they had done. that the documents she had released would eventually find their way to people brave enough to publish them, that the pattern was too large to hide forever. She said that every person they disappeared was a seed of resistance, that eventually there would be too many missing voices for the silence to continue. The interrogator stood up and left. Rebecca was moved to a different section of the facility, smaller cells, less frequent contact with guards or interrogators. Days blurred into weeks, blurred into something that might have been months or years. She marked time by scratching lines into the concrete with a pebble she had found, creating her own calendar, her own record of existence. But Rebecca wasn't entirely alone in the darkness. One day, a different guard appeared at her cell door, a young woman with kind eyes who moved with nervous energy. The guard whispered that she had only a moment, that someone outside was still fighting, still trying to expose what was happening at these facilities. She said that Rebecca's documentation had reached several journalists, that investigations were slowly beginning, that some members of Congress were finally asking questions about private detention facilities and the legal authorities under which they operated. The guard said her own sister had been an activist, had disappeared 2 years ago after organizing protests about police violence and corporate influence on local government. She said she had taken this job to find her sister, to learn the truth, and now she knew that truth, and it was worse than she had imagined. She said that she couldn't free Rebecca, not without endangering both of them and accomplishing nothing. But she could make sure Rebecca knew that her sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that the truth was leaking out, despite all efforts to contain it. Before the guard left, she pressed something into Rebecca's hand. A small photograph, printed on regular paper, grainy and damaged. Rebecca's breath caught when she saw it. Emma, standing in a protest line, her sign about freedom of speech visible, taken the day she disappeared. Written on the back in pen, they can erase records, but not memories. Keep fighting. Rebecca clutched the photograph like a sacred object. She didn't know who had sent it, didn't know if it was meant to give her hope or simply to torture her with what had been lost. But it reminded her that Emma had existed, that her fight had meant something, that the struggle for freedom required constant vigilance and sacrifice. Time continued its strange passage. Rebecca developed routines to maintain her sanity, exercises in her cell, meditations on memories she refused to let go, silent recitations of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment's protections that seemed so distant now. She thought often about the daguerreotype child, about how that girl had been erased from official records but preserved in silver and chemicals, her image waiting over a century to be revealed. The interrogations became less frequent but more sophisticated. They brought in psychologists who tried different approaches: empathy, manipulation, gaslighting, periods of kindness followed by harsh isolation. They told her that the facility was closing down, that she would soon be released, that all she needed to do was sign a few documents. Then they would withdraw the offer and tell her she would never leave. They showed her fabricated news articles about how the investigation into private detention facilities had found nothing, that the allegations had been debunked, that conspiracy theorists had been spreading disinformation. Rebecca learned to exist in a state of deliberate uncertainty, never fully believing anything they told her, but also never letting go of her core truths. Emma existed. The pattern was real. Freedom required defenders, and silence in the face of injustice was complicity. She held these truths like stones in her pocket, solid and undeniable, even when everything else seemed fluid and malleable. One night, or perhaps it was day, Rebecca woke to alarms blaring throughout the facility. Shouts, running footsteps, the sound of doors being forced open. Federal agents poured into the facility, weapons drawn, shouting orders. Rebecca heard later that a coalition of civil liberties organizations and journalists had finally assembled enough evidence to force a raid, that several senators had threatened to go public with what they knew about private detention facilities if the Justice Department didn't act. The raid didn't free everyone, didn't expose everything. The facility Rebecca was in was just one of many. And the legal complexities of what had been done there, the layers of classification and private contracting and national security justifications, would take years to unravel in courts. Many detainees had already been moved to other locations or released with binding NDAs and substantial settlements in exchange for their silence. But Rebecca was freed. She walked out of that facility on a cold morning in what she later learned was early spring, having lost nearly 2 years of her life to that concrete darkness. The world outside seemed impossibly bright, impossibly large. She stood on the facility's steps, blinking in sunlight she had almost forgotten, and felt both profound relief and overwhelming grief. Emma wasn't among the detainees freed. Most of the records had been destroyed before the raid, making it nearly impossible to determine who had been held at the facility and what had happened to them. Rebecca received a settlement from the government and a lengthy apology from officials who simultaneously insisted that everything done had been legal under classified authorities. She signed nothing, accepted no money that came with strings attached. Instead, she filed lawsuits, testified before Congress, gave interviews to any journalist willing to listen. The daguerreotype became famous in a small way. Rebecca's story of discovering the missing child, of connecting that 1884 image to a pattern of disappearances stretching across more than a century, captured public imagination. Historians began investigating the Fairchild family more thoroughly, uncovering evidence of their involvement in suppressing labor movements and making activist organizers disappear. Genealogists discovered that several prominent families in Boston had similar histories, fortunes built partially on the elimination of threats to their economic power. But the full truth remained elusive. Most facilities like the one that had held Rebecca were never raided, never exposed. The legal authorities that had been used to justify them remained classified. Some politicians called for reforms, for greater oversight, for restrictions on private contractors. Others insisted that such measures would compromise national security, that in a dangerous world, absolute freedom was a luxury no nation could afford. Rebecca returned to her work at the Historical Society, though she could never look at old photographs the same way. Each image now seemed to carry the possibility of hidden stories, erased lives, truths deliberately obscured. She created an archive of disappearances, a database that anyone could contribute to, documenting people who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. It grew slowly but steadily, thousands of names, each one representing someone who had been erased or intimidated into silence. On the 3rd anniversary of the raid that had freed her, Rebecca stood before a congressional committee investigating detention practices. She held up the daguerreotype of the Fairchild family, that impossible child staring out from between her erased parents. She told the committee that this was the face of every person who disappeared for demanding rights, for questioning power, for believing that freedom meant more than comfortable submission. She said that the fight for freedom was never finished, that every generation had to defend it anew against those who would sacrifice liberty for security, justice for order, truth for convenience. She said that Emma and James and David and thousands of others had given everything to shine light into this darkness, and that their sacrifice obligated the living to continue that work, to never stop demanding accountability, to never accept that disappearance was an acceptable price for stability. The committee thanked her for her testimony and moved on to other business. Some reform legislation was eventually passed, requiring greater oversight of private contractors, restricting some of the authorities that had been used to justify indefinite detention. But loopholes remained, classified interpretations persisted, and Rebecca knew that in dark corners of the bureaucracy, in facilities whose locations remained secret, the practice of making inconvenient people disappear continued. Rebecca visited Emma's grave, a memorial stone in a cemetery outside Boston, marking a death that had never been confirmed, a body that had never been found. She placed fresh flowers and told her daughter about the small victories, the incremental progress, the ways that exposure had made some practices more difficult, if not impossible. She told Emma that the fight continued, that others had taken up the cause, that the seeds Emma had planted were growing in unexpected places. Standing there among the graves, Rebecca thought about the daguerreotype child, forever frozen between parents who claimed she didn't exist. She thought about how every authoritarian impulse began with the same lie, that certain people didn't matter, that their disappearance was justified, that freedom was negotiable depending on the circumstances. She thought about how democracies died not in sudden coups, but in gradual erosions, one disappeared voice at a time, one accepted emergency power at a time, one failure to demand accountability at a time. Rebecca left the cemetery as autumn leaves began to fall again, the cycle of seasons continuing, indifferent to human struggle. She returned to her apartment and opened her laptop, adding new entries to her database of disappearances. There were always more names, more stories, more people who had asked the wrong questions or challenged the wrong powers and found themselves erased from the comfortable narrative of freedom and justice. But there were also more people fighting back, demanding answers, refusing to accept that disappearance was normal or acceptable. Young activists who had learned about Emma's story and Rebecca's ordeal were organizing, creating networks to document and respond to suspicious disappearances, shining light into corners that powerful interests wanted to keep dark. Journalists were investigating despite threats and pressure. Lawyers were filing lawsuits despite the personal and professional costs. Citizens were demanding accountability despite official assurances that everything was legal and necessary. Rebecca knew she would never see Emma again, never get those lost years back, never fully recover from what had been done to her in that facility. But she also knew that her daughter's life and death had meant something, had contributed to a larger struggle that stretched across generations. She knew that the fight for freedom was not about winning once and for all, but about the daily practice of refusing to accept injustice, of speaking truth even when silence was easier, of remembering the disappeared even when forgetting was encouraged. Late that night, working by lamplight, Rebecca received an encrypted message from an unknown sender. It contained a single photograph, another daguerreotype, recently discovered in an estate sale in Philadelphia. The image showed a group of young women, factory workers from the early 20th century, standing outside a textile mill. But in the background, barely visible, was a girl who seemed wrong somehow, her face too clear, her eyes too knowing, staring directly at the camera with that same unsettling intensity as the Fairchild child. Attached to the photograph was a brief message. "They've been erasing us for over a century, but images remember what records forget. Keep looking, keep telling." Rebecca studied the new daguerreotype on her screen, feeling that familiar mix of horror and determination. She saved the image, added it to her growing collection of evidence, and continued her work. The disappeared could not speak for themselves, but their images remained. Their stories persisted. Their absence testified to the constant vigilance freedom required. As long as people like Rebecca refused to forget, refused to accept that disappearance was normal, the struggle would continue. Outside her window, Boston slept under stars that had witnessed over a century of vanished voices. Inside, Rebecca worked through the night, documenting, preserving, bearing witness. The daguerreotype child watched from her computer screen, that impossible girl who should not exist but could not be denied, a permanent reminder that the price of freedom was constant resistance to those who would erase inconvenient truths. And in the morning, Rebecca would wake and continue the fight, one day at a time, one truth at a time, one remembered face at a time, refusing to let the disappeared vanish completely, refusing to accept that silence was inevitable, refusing to forget that freedom without the ability to question and resist was no freedom at all.